Welcome back to our series about exploring the meaning of Christian identity by exploring the sojourning history of Israel. In the last section, we learned about the cultural and historical context of Israel's sojourn into Egypt and why a new king came to power who began to oppress them. In this section, we will learn about the story of Moses and how God spoke to him and inspired him in a way that spoke to his mixed sense of Egyptian culture and identity. In the previous section, we saw that it was the 18th dynasty that was the dynasty that was responsible for expelling the Hyksos out of Egypt. And we also saw that it was the 18th dynasty that could be synchronized with the Pharaoh who did not know Joseph. And while we know that Joseph was not himself a Hyksos, it is possible that the regime that he served at the time was, since it is mentioned that they possessed chariots. This is found in Genesis 41, 43, and 59. And it is believed that chariots were not used in Egypt until the Hyksos introduced them there. Now that Canaanites were seen as the hated enemy, anyone with Canaanite affiliations would have been suspect. When the Egyptians retook Goshen, it was likely that they felt surrounded by a remaining diasporic Canaanite population. Concerning excavations in Avaris, the old Hyksos capital in Goshen, Hofmeyr reports that, while the site for the most part seems to have been abandoned, the Seth Temple continued to be used through the 18th dynasty, until major renovations were initiated under Horemheb. Since the Seth Temple was permitted to function on some basis, it appears there must have been a sufficient number of possibly Asiatic devotees. Apparently, the entire Asiatic population of the Hyksos capital was not eliminated or forced to retreat to Canaan, even though the elite, and certainly the military, departed. So in other words, it seems that the Seth Temple continued to operate even after the Egyptians retook northern Egypt from the Hyksos. And since Seth was the main god of the Egyptian Canaanites, or Canaanite Egyptians, the fact that the temple was still running for a while afterwards implies that a large amount of Canaanite Egyptians remained in the city. This would have posed a security threat, since Goshen was a border region. If the Hyksos ever returned, then the Canaanite diaspora in Goshen would have been suspect in becoming a fifth column. Archaeology has shown that this fear was not at all unfounded. There appears to have been no major destruction to mark what pt6 called the second major Canaanite incursion, which was the arrival of the Hyksos. But that does not mean that they were not invaders, since they may not have needed to conquer cities occupied by fellow Semitic-speaking people. In other words, when the Hyksos first invaded Egypt, cities occupied by large Canaanite diasporas did not show much destruction, which implies either being bypassed or having been rather complicit and collaborationists in the regime change. Thus, the Egyptians saw all Canaanites as being guilty, even those born natively in Egypt for generations. And since the Israelites were of Canaanite heritage, they would have been targeted as now being an enemy from within, similar to the treatment of Japanese Americans in World War II. In fact, that the passages also depict the Egyptians as being rather sadistic to the Hebrews, in terms of working them for the expressed purpose of oppressing them and ruthlessly making their lives bitter, which we read in Exodus 1:11, 13 and verses 13 to 14, may express the anti-Canaanite and revanchist spirit that was very much felt by Egyptians after the retaking of the region. In fact, during this time, Egypt was launching a series of campaigns into Canaan in order to inspire terror and to bring back enslaved captives to build up the new empire. Taking prisoners of war from Western Asia during the Empire period is well attested in private and royal monuments, It is clear that once the policy of employing prisoners of war in labor projects was introduced, the Israelites and other Semites already living in Egypt were treated likewise. Thus, the Israelites were once again treated as Habiru in the truest sense, as slaves and foreigners, though in a land that they once thought had been their own home, similar to the alienating experiences of German Americans in the wake of World War I, Asian Americans in the wake of World War II, and even Muslim Americans after 9/11. Although the Egyptians began their war as a conflict of liberation, they quickly arose from being the oppressed into becoming the oppressors. Perhaps this ideological shift showed its maturity when Egyptian pharaohs began to fully embrace the worship of the violent god Seth under the Ramesside kings. If a historical Moses lived, then his life likely would have depicted life under the Ramesside kings, including the massacre of innocents that took place around the time of his birth. Hofmeyr tells us that if there is a prevailing view among historians, biblical scholars and archaeologists, an Exodus in the Ramesside era is still favored. However, the Egyptians were not genocidal. Their goal was not to destroy the Canaanites, but to bring them under control. When the Egyptian princess found and adopted Moses, they knew that he was a Hebrew, but in direct contradiction to Pharaoh's orders, Moses was to be spared despite this. This is because it may have been perceived that Moses would actually be more useful for the Egyptians alive than dead concerning their imperialistic agenda. This is because during the New Kingdom, Thutmose III initiated the practice of bringing the princes of subject kings of Western Asia to Egypt to be trained in Egyptian ways, so as to prepare them to replace their fathers upon their death. The logic of this was to create a loyal and civilized cadre of foreign elites that would be loyal and acculturated to the Egyptian empire and to the Egyptian way of life. These elites would then be sent out as colonial administrators who would serve as loyal middlemen between their colonized kin and their Egyptian overlords. Little is known about this institution in the Middle Kingdom, but it flourished in the New Kingdom and was open to foreigners, Nubians, and Semites alike. In a study of the children of the nursery during the 18th dynasty, Betsy Bryan observes that among them were children of foreign rulers who were sent or taken as hostages to Egypt to be civilized and then returned to rule as vassals. Therefore, it is highly likely that Moses was taken in to be groomed to become a colonial administrator or even an internal administrator over Hebrew affairs, with his purpose being to promote and solidify Egyptian interests and power among and over the subjected peoples. This would again make Moses a liminal character, caught between the Egyptian culture he would have been raised in and the Hebrew heritage of his birth. However, Moses seemed to have been aware of his conflicting position. This is because when Moses was perhaps performing his administrative duties, he began to show a desire to use his power and position to improve the lives of his people instead of merely serving the interests of Pharaoh. For example, this was shown when he decided to avenge a mistreated Hebrew by killing an Egyptian overseer, and then he tried to arbitrate a dispute between two Hebrews, only to have his murder of the Egyptian become uncovered, which caused him to become a fugitive, a Habiru, in the wilderness. Released from the conflict of the opposing structures of Egypt, it is here in the liminality of the wilderness where God spoke to Moses in a way that freed and appealed to his potential liminal creativity. This is because when God spoke to Moses in the burning bush, it is possible that God was speaking to Moses' cultural hybridity by subtly implying that God was a God like Amun, but an Amun for the Hebrews. This is because, as discussed earlier, Amun was a god of justice who cared for the poor and the oppressed, which God expressed as being God's prime reason for God's self-revelation to Moses, where God says in Exodus 3:7-8, I have observed the misery of my people who are in Egypt. I have heard their cry on account of their taskmasters. Indeed, I know their sufferings, and I have come to deliver them from the Egyptians. Moreover, when God answers Moses' question concerning God's name and identity, God answers evasively, I am who I am, thus giving the impression that God's identity is tied to pure being itself. Now, synchronizing the attributes of gods would have been something Moses would have naturally done, since that was a given for the culture he was raised in. For God to reveal God's self to Moses by appealing to the attributes of a God that Moses would have already known would have been a way to make God's self readily known and understood by appealing to the images and motifs that were already culturally familiar. And for Moses, this would have been the figure of Amun. So in other words, instead of God using time to explain, everything from scratch, it was much easier to tell Moses, this character, I'm like that. Cool, let's move on now. Indeed, for the Egyptians, the attributes of Amun are all coincidentally attributes that the Hebrews, through Moses' hybrid Egyptian theology, would apply to God. This is because Donald Redford tells us that the name Amun, which is Imin, indicated his essential being, for its meaning was the hidden one, or the secret one. According to myth, his true name was unknown, thus indicating his unknowable essence. This imperceptibility owed to the absolute otherness or holiness of the deity, and it is attested that he was totally different from all other beings and transcendent of the created universe. Now think back to what God said to Moses. When Moses asked God what was God's name, God did not give Moses a name. Rather, God said, I am who I am, thus comparing himself to Amun as a god without a name, a hidden god, thus inviting these comparisons between God and the character of Amun. Another Egyptian feature of Moses' hybrid theology was the revealed hidden nature of God, which reflected the hidden and revealed nature of Amun-Ra. According to Redford, in his developed form, Amun-Ra combined within himself the two opposite realities of divinity, the hidden and the revealed. While Amun was the hidden aspect, Ra was the revealed aspect, which parallels Mosaic theology, with God being both hidden and transcendent, but also revealed and immanent through the angel of the Lord and God Shekinah, which can then be synchronized with the hiddenness of the Father and the immanence of the Son in Christian theology. In other words, just as Egyptians believed that Amun-Ra was both transcendent and beyond the universe, while at the same time paradoxically being present and revealed in the universe at the same time, these qualities were believed to be possessed by God as well. Additionally, Amun-Ra was the Egyptian creator deity par excellence. His association with the air as an invisible force facilitated his development as supreme creator. He was self-created, without father or mother. He became the greatest expression of a transcendent creator ever known in Egyptian theology. He was not immanent within creation, and creation was not an extension of himself. He remained apart from it, and fully independent of it. As with the creator deity of the Hebrew Scriptures, Amun-Ra carried out his creative action in virtue of his supreme power. He did not physically engender the universe, as had happened in the creation myth of Ra-Atum in Heliopolis. His position as king of the gods increased to a point that approached monotheism. In Amun-Ra's most advanced theological expressions, the other gods became symbols of his power and manifestations of him, he himself being the one and only supreme divine power. In fact, within an Egyptian creation myth, the four aspects of the primordial cosmos were described as being water, infinity or timelessness, darkness, and hiddenness or wind, which are identical to the ingredients of the Hebrew primordial world in Genesis, where we read in Genesis 1 that in the beginning, the earth was a formless void, and darkness covered the face of the deep, as a wind from God hovered over the face of the waters, with both God and Amun being identified with the aspect of wind in their respective myths. Mosaic theology also seems to express the Egyptian motif of dyads within creation, because Wilkinson reports how duality is at the heart of the Egyptian concept of the universe itself. Egyptian thought usually stresses their complementary nature as a way of expressing the essential unity of existence, heaven and earth, existence and non-existence, stasis and change, north and south, desert and fertile, day and night, etc. Almost invariably, dyads are composed of male and female elements, and in Genesis, we see similar pairings between heaven and earth, light and darkness, day and night, sky and ocean, earth and vegetation, sun and moon, birds and fish, animals and humans, with the image of God then being expressed in humanity through male and female, all within Genesis 1. So when you read the first chapter of Genesis, remember to take notice of this, how on every day, two things are being created at the same time, in balance and harmony with the other. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And then by the end of the first day, God creates light and darkness by bringing light out of the darkness. In day 2, God separates the waters to create sky and the ocean. On day 3, God creates the earth and vegetation upon the earth. On day 4, God gives purpose to the sun and the moon. And on day 5, God creates the birds and the fish, the birds to inhabit the sky above, and the fish to inhabit the oceans below. And on day 6, we have animals and humans who are depicted as working together in a kind of symbiotic relationship in Genesis 2, with the image of God then being expressed through the oneness of male and female to bring our final example of balance and harmony within God's creation. Additionally, concerning the Mosaic designs for the tabernacle, it should be noted that within Amun's temple, his shrine was the innermost and darkest part of the temple, and he could only be approached through the proper ritual by authorized persons. Even when in public procession, his portable shrine was wrapped in a protective covering. These features can be synchronized with the Holy of Holies, which was the innermost, darkest part of the temple, which was entered only once a year by the chief priest after performing the atoning sacrifice, while God's portable shrine was the Ark of the Covenant, with the Ark being the protective covering of God's holy law. Finally, for Christians who wish to see the Trinity expressed in Hebrew Scripture through God, the angel of the Lord, or Shekinah, and the Ruach Kodesh, it is of interest to note that for ancient Egyptians, the number 3 was an important one, signifying plurality, or unity expressed in plurality. Thus, recognizing Mosaic theology as containing a hybrid Egyptian theology may cause us to ask how God may be speaking through other cultures as well in order to prepare them for their reconciliation with the hidden God through the work of the revealed Son and Holy Spirit. We therefore see a historic symmetry between the experiences of the Egyptians and the Hebrews, and that just as the Egyptians believed that Amun delivered them from Hyksos oppression, so now was God going to deliver the Hebrews from Egyptian oppression. The Exodus depicts God's actions as being judgment on the gods of Egypt. By revisiting the historical background that led up to the Exodus, we can see that God's judgment of Egypt was a judgment on the Egyptians' abandonment of justice in the pursuit of nationalist and supremacist military political power, as expressed in Pharaoh's policies. A key nuance to understand this is that within Egyptian theology, Pharaoh himself was understood as being a god, and was responsible for upholding Ma'at, or cosmic harmony. Hofmeyr observes how the cosmic confrontation is played out with Pharaoh as the representative of Egypt's gods. The centrality of Pharaoh in the plague cycle is further realized when we consider the Egyptian monarch's responsibility to maintain cosmic order, Ma'at, that was established by the Creator God. If there was a failure in the land, Isfit, a state of chaos, was said to prevail. By the Egyptians becoming a vengeful oppressor, God was making the point that Pharaoh had abandoned and broken Ma'at, becoming an agent of injustice instead of justice. This understanding is deepened when we remember the Ramesside patronage of Seth, the god of chaos, which reinforces the understanding that God was judging Egypt for its national policies. Additionally, if the Egyptians perceived God as acting in the place of Amun, then it could also signify Amun's rejection of Egypt in favor of the oppressed Hebrews, who would now be the new heirs and guardians of Ma'at in Pharaoh's place. Indeed, when Moses received the law from God, he may have understood this as God choosing Israel to be the new upholders of Ma'at, since Pharaoh had failed miserably in doing so. Hence God said, "You have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I bore you on eagle's wings, and brought you to myself. Now therefore, if you obey my voice, and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession out of all the peoples. Indeed, the whole earth is mine, but you shall be for me a priestly kingdom and a holy nation." This was revolutionary, because no more would cosmic justice be upheld by kings, but this power and responsibility would be given to the oppressed peoples themselves as God's new agents. Since Baal/Seth was understood to be the enemy of Ma'at, Israel's mission to return to Canaan ought to be understood as their calling to overthrow the forces of chaos and injustice, so that cosmic harmony can be restored. In other words, the revolution that began in Egypt was now to be spread back into the land of their ancestors, which had long been ruled by Baal-worshipping kings. Contrary to imaginings of Canaan being innocent before the conquest, secular archaeology has shown that Canaan had long been subject to social injustice, especially economically, at the hands of urban elites who were often collaborators with Egypt. From the Catholic Encyclopedia, we can read, in the political, social, and economic context of the second millennium, the principal sources of their hardships, which were referring to the Canaanite peasants, are obvious. The hand of the crown lay heavy on the populace, especially in vassal territories, where the inhabitants not only had to pay tribute to the suzerain, but had to lodge and feed his troops and officials as well. It is not by chance that the principal source of information of the Hebrew is the Amarna letters written by the Egyptian vassals. The oppressive demands of kings in general are well described in 1 Samuel 8:11-17, and the accuracy of this passage has been completely confirmed by the administrative texts from the palace archives of Ugarit. A large part of the Syro-Palestinian population were serfs, whose lives must often have been a struggle for survival. And again, this is because the peasants, who were about 90% of the population, were having their income, whatever they made, whatever they could take in from their farms, just being taken away in a large amount of taxation and tributes that are meant to enrich the wealthy urban elites and their Egyptian overlords. So instead of a conquest, then, the invasion of Canaan may actually have been a liberation, particularly for the peasants. This would then show how the sojourn to Egypt and return to Canaan would still fit with the pattern of marginalization, liminal awakening, and a return to reconciliation. And this is because the Hebrews became marginal in Egypt, becoming liminal between the Canaanite and Egyptian worlds, which allowed them to rethink the whole system in terms of how it ought to be structured. In Egypt, they would be exposed to Amun theology and the history of Egypt's liberation. With these experiences in mind, they would be prepared to understand God's own mission for them, and that just as Amun would lead Egypt against Hyksos oppression, so too will God lead Israel to liberation from Egyptian oppression, to create a better world, more in line with the Egyptian notion of Ma'at than the Egyptians themselves. This is because Egypt failed Ma'at by oppressing the foreigner and the slave, the Hebrew. Thus, through the Hebrews, God was going to create a new order that will take the oppressed experiences of Hebrew as the founding point upon which all questions of justice are to be related back to. Hence God continually said to them, remember that you were a slave in Egypt, or something like that throughout the Mosaic Law. Examples can be found in Deuteronomy 24:18 and 24 and 22. No one understands the oppressed like the oppressed, which is why Israel was called to remember their marginalized experiences, so that they may not be conformed to the centralist values like the Egyptians were after they regained power, but truly transform the center by bringing the needs of the marginalized to the forefront, so as to create true and radical reformation. To not do so would be betraying everything that God set them free for. So this would mean, therefore, that the conquest of Canaan should not be understood as a war between Israelites and Canaanites, but it was rather a return movement in which diasporic Canaanites, who were the Hebrews, returned to their ancestral home so as to reform and conform it with the new political and religious understandings that they had learned and experienced in Egypt. Just as God set them free in Egypt, so now were these shepherds returning home to liberate their farmer siblings, who never left home as well, teaching them everything that they had learned through their experiences abroad. This is why the regime change was to be accompanied by the destruction of Baal worship, so as to remove the violent ideologies that Baal stood for in the minds of the Hebrews, since to them he was tied with Seth, and replaced them with a reverence for God's cosmic harmony. So when we read about God driving out the Canaanites, the element that was driven out ought to be understood as referring to the urban social and political elites who oppressed the poor and followed the ideology of Baal/Seth. Because if we understand the judgment of Canaan as mirroring the judgment of Israel under the Assyrians and Babylonians as foreshadowed in the law, for example in Deuteronomy 8:20, then what happened to the Canaanites should mirror what happened to the Israelites, since God was not playing favorites between them, as expressed in Deuteronomy 9:4-6, but was judging them for doing the same things, namely the worship of Baal and the oppression of the poor, thus holding both groups equally accountable. So again, when Israel was sent to drive out the Canaanites, they weren't driving out the majority of the Canaanites, but rather a population that was probably representative of at most 10%, maybe less than, which were mostly the urban and political elites who would have had the corrupting power over the land. They were the ones that needed to be driven out. Because again, if you remember what happened in Egypt when the Hyksos were driven out, most of the regular people stayed behind because in ancient regime changes, only the elites actually were expelled. Most of the regular people were allowed to stay behind. Indeed, it was because Israel likewise failed God in upholding social justice and cosmic harmony by subscribing to the ways and worship of Baal in conjunction with exploiting the weak in the same way that the Egyptian Empire did, that God will prove God's impartiality by punishing Israel in the same way that God disciplined everyone else. And this is what we will see in the next section, in which we learn that after Israel began to worship Baal and oppress the poor in the same way that the old Canaanite kings did, God will treat them in the same way by allowing Israel to be conquered and have their elites being expelled and exiled in places like Assyria and Babylon. And so in the next section, we will learn about Israel's experience in the Babylonian exile and how that continued to reform Israel's understanding of God and their place in the world.